Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we're going to do the age-old battle of Synology versus QNAP. It's something we've done on this channel about a million times by now, but more and more whenever we look at solutions from these two brands, it always comes down to the same thing, doesn't it? Hardware versus software, first party versus third party, and more and more. But over the years, those lines have blurred a lot. When it's come to buying your first NAS, maybe you've found this video and you've never really known much about NAS and you're jumping away from the Google Cloud or your Microsoft Cloud or whatever cloud you're rocking these days, maybe a Dropbox. Or you've been a keen follower of NAS, or maybe you're upgrading something you bought a few years ago and you come back to the channel. Hello, welcome back. Regardless of why you find yourself watching this, it has to be said that when it comes to buying a solution from either one of these two brands, your priorities are going to be different, because for two brands that produce relatively similar products, my God, the output and what their focus is differs wildly. And throughout today's video, I'm going to be comparing these two NASs. It has to be said that a lot of the comparison is going to be brand rhetoric. It's going to be what they think a NAS at this level should offer. So today we're comparing a 4-bay and a 5-bay, both of which are 2022 generation. The QNAP is the TS-464. It is a 4-bay NAS system that arrives with QNAP's own kind of harness software there, QTS5. It's an ext4 platform, and we'll talk more about QTS later in the video. Indeed, I know I'm utilising graphics on screen for today's video, but it's only because I don't have the 5-bay here in the studio. I even have the 4-bay QNAP here just off shot, but just for the sake of keeping it all nice and mainstream and similar, I'm using the weirdo graphics for both. Now, the 1522 on the other hand, this is a 5-bay system, and again, not only is this Synology's own position on hardware, but they've changed quite a lot in their hardware focus on their disk station steers, at least as far as the 5-bay is concerned in this generation. And whereas previous videos, when I've compared Synology and QNAP systems that are relatively similar, either the same bays or kind of the same, generally the hardware is, comparable. In this case, these are very, very different NASs right now. They may look very, very similar in terms of design and shape and that kind of thing. And they're both little desktop boxes that look like set up and forget them. But they're very different in terms of internal and indeed external connectivity and architecture. So let's crack on with it. A number of you are already going to be looking at the price tags. The TS-464, again, the price, they're both quite new, so there's not a lot of flexibility. It's knocking around for about $550 to $600. Now, again, that doesn't include your local tax. That's utilising prices on Newegg. But again, availability is still very, very low on both of these. In the case of the 1522, the price tag is estimated around $699 to around $750. But again, hasn't really been released at the time of recording, and everything we're looking at here is pretty much based on RRP, recommended retail price. So in today's video, we're going to be comparing these two and your value for money in some ways in 4 key areas. We're going to be looking at the internal hardware, your CPU, your memory and more. We're going to be looking at storage, because let's face it, you're buying these for storage, how they handle it, what they can and cannot do. We're going to be looking at external connectivity, the ports, the connections, how they can be scaled, what they can do and the bandwidth. And finally, we're going to look at the software, and the software is going to be looking at what you get for your money, because all of these arrive with the software, and just how it can be customized, scales, how usable it is, security and more. So number one, let's talk about that internal architecture. Now, between the two of these, it has to be said the QNAP offering there in terms of its internal hardware, it's probably the easiest to translate, at least as far as traditional architecture. It's arriving with an Intel Celeron-based processor there. That's the N5105 or the N5095. Pandemic, hardware shortages, CPU refreshes overlapping. Watch my other videos and learn more. That CPU is a quad-core 2.0 GHz processor that can be burst up to 2.9 GHz per core on that quad-core processor. It's also got embedded graphics on board there, so again 1080p, 4K. There's a part of the CPU on board that is designed to handle graphics more efficiently, and again that CPU, it's got the standard floating point AES-NI encryption. It's got around about 4000 grade on CPU benchmark. So the system arrives on 90 watt PSU, and the thermal design power, or TDP, is 10 watts on that Celeron processor there. Now, when the 1522 was first being spoken about, everyone assumed it would have that CPU and it would have that memory, which again was DDR4 2666 megahertz memory it starts at 4 gig and can be upgraded to 16 gig. Everyone assumed the 1522, myself included, would arrive with that, but Synology went off in a completely different direction, moving the system a little bit more towards the business user. It arrives with an AMD embedded Ryzen processor. It's a dual core processor there, so again, not quad core, but it makes up with it with a higher clock speed at 2.6 gigahertz that can be burst up to 3.1. I hate seagulls. Wait, I hate seagulls. Now, that CPU, although it doesn't have embedded graphics there, it is a 4-thread 2-core processor there. So again, when it comes to utilizing and allocating a lot of those assets, that is something that is open to it. On top of that, the system arrives with 8 gig of DDR4 ECC memory by default, so error code correction or error correcting code. In other words, memory that as data passes through the memory process, there's an extra cell on the memory module that analyzes data as it passes through, and if it does a checksum system at the beginning and the end, and heals the file if it notices any inconsistencies, which is great for combating bit rot and other file inconsistencies at the smallest bit level. Now, that memory can be upgraded up to 32 gigs, so it starts with more and can be scaled higher, which is great news there. I know the CPU didn't win everyone over, but the scalability of that memory is definitely something worth writing home about. The system arrives with a 120 watt PSU, and again, that CPU is going to run a little hotter at 25 watt rating TDP. Now, between the two of them, it may come as no surprise that if you're a multimedia user, I'm going to recommend this one. I'm going to recommend the QNAP. It's got 4K and 1080p transcoding built into it there. It is going to utilize that hardware towards multimedia that little bit better. Now, the 1522 Plus, that CPU, it's still going to be able to transcode. It's still going to be able to play back media, but it's going to do it less efficiently. It's going to use more resources there in order to do it. It's going to use more resources to do more atypical visual things. Now, if you're going to be streaming multimedia, a lot of users tend to overlook the fact that if you have particularly modern high-end media, it has a tendency to arrive in HEVC format, otherwise known as highly efficient video codec, otherwise known as H.265, a compression technique that takes those giant movies we watch and compresses them down to something we can watch at home. Now, that also applies to HDR and 10-bit media, I might add as well. Now, neither of these systems arrive with a license or approved patent license for HEVC media. If you're using the older style of compression known as H.264, which a lot of media still is, you're going to be fine. You'll be absolutely fine. 1080p, 4K, it will play it native, it will transcode it fine. But with HEVC, the issue is, if it doesn't have the license built, with the client hardware, it will automatically have to convert that file. We've done it in Plex testing, we did it in MB, we did it in Video Station, because it doesn't have that patent, because the HEVC patent is a shared license. It's a real problem. If it doesn't have that license in it, which it doesn't, it's going to use way more resources to play back that higher end, more modern compressed media in HEVC, H.265, 10-bit HDR, etc. So if you're a multimedia user, move to this end of the table. However, if you're a VM user, if you are you're using larger databases, if you can be running surveillance, that extra memory is going to come in handy. And the fact that that CPU is much more file processing centric, it's got the 4-thread architecture, again, VMs, surveillance, and just general file sharing are going to be handled on larger volume scale on the 1522. And again, that business focus is singing through and through. Now, in terms of storage on these two systems, it's actually really, really intriguing. The reason is that although one is a 4-bay, one is a 5-bay, and then you might be thinking, well, obviously the 5-bay is going to win at storage. It's got more bays. Get out of my face. I get it. But hear me out. There's actually a hell of a lot more to that. And there's a lot of give and take between these two systems that's much like the internal architecture will make you think, ooh, I'm going to have to pick and choose. I'm going to have to cherry pick a bit here. Case in point. The 1522 is a 5-bay NAS but it also arrives with support of up to 2 expansions, the DX517, 2 expansions that are connected via eSATA, so 6 gigabits per second, and each one of those being JBOD, just a bunch of drives, where the RAID is managed by the core NAS system. It ultimately means you can attach 10 more drives, making this a total combined potential storage system of 15 bays of SATA storage. It also arrives with 2 M2 NVMe slots, which allow you to install super fast SSDs like the Seagate Ironwolf, like the WD Red, and that allows you to improve both the read and the write operations within your system utilizing caching, where in the case of write caching, data is written to the SSD and then that is moved to the system over time. With read caching, copies of most frequently accessed files, which can go all the way down to the metadata level, which you can pin if you choose, all the way back to just general file backend stuff, will be copied over to the SSDs, and then those more frequently accessed files will be obtained from the faster SSDs, not the slower RAID array. SSD caching has evolved so much in recent years, and DSM-7 does a great job of caching. But you can't use those M2 NVMe bays for anything but caching, which again is going to be important, we'll get onto in a little bit. You can't use them as a raw storage pool, just the cache. Now, it does arrive with support of BTRFS. Both systems arrive with support of the ext4 file system, but the BTRFS or butter file system allows things like faster snapshot creation, with more efficient as well, near instantaneous shared folder duplication, file self-healing, much like ECC memory, running a checksum system against write data. The inconsistencies are repaired automatically on the spot. BTRFS, although the younger file system and arguably doesn't perform quite as well as ext4 in more mainstream deployment, and it's a very small margin, is still great for desktop systems and home users that want to take advantage of more advanced storage redundancy and backup options, and again snapshots being key there, without it impacting their system too much. Additionally, the Synology platform arrived with support of Synology Hybrid RAID, SHR, not just the normal RAIDs like your RAID 1, your RAID 5, your RAID 6, where you have 1 or 2 disk redundancies. SHR allows you to mix and match the drives that are inside. Ergo, maybe you're going to get this 5-bay and stick 2 drives in it. You can run these systems with as little as 1 drive if you want. But say you put 2 drives in with a 1 disk redundancy there, so 1 disk safety net. A few years down the line, you want to add some more drives. SHR allows you to mix and match the drives to add bigger drives down the line, something traditional RAID will not allow you to do without capping the drives and also making it a little bit more unstable using those mixed drives. SHR is available on this system, and it's one of the main attractive things that brought a lot of people to even the most affordable Synology NAS system with their SHR. Now, what could QNAP possibly bring to beat all of the stuff that I've said? Well, what QNAP brings to the table to counter this, although it's a 4-bay system, it can be expanded by 2 expansion chassis. Now, unlike the Synology side, where you can only use the DX517 5-bay expansion via eSATA, so 6 gigabits per second, the QNAP arrives with support of several different expansions. There's a 2-bay, a 4-bay, and an 8-bay expansion in the D800C. These expansions can arrive in JBOD, as mentioned, just a bunch of drives managed by the NAS, but they can also arrive in hardware RAID, where RAID is actually built into the expansion, and therefore it manages its own RAID configuration. On top of that, these expansions are USB 3.2 Gen 2. So that's 1,000 megabytes per second throughput rather than 600 megabytes per second of eSATA. Now, why is that important? If you're fully populating these chassis, that's a lot of throughput. An 8-bay or a 5-bay, you put decent drives inside there, you are going to surpass 600 megabytes per second of eSATA, and therefore using the USB expansion via USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports allows greater bandwidth between the expansion and the NAS system. So flexibility and faster expansions to start with. The next thing is those NVMe SSD bays, because both of these systems have got M2 NVMe bays, but on the QNAP, those M2 bays can be used for caching, but they can also be used for storage pools. You can use them just like you would normal hard drives in the traditional hard drive or SATA SSD bays there. These M2 NVMe's can be pulled together in a RAID 1 or even a RAID 0 for increased performance to be used for just key applications like Plex, virtualization and surveillance, or to run the system operating system. It can be used for lots of things. Of course, caching is on the table, read caching, write caching, or both. There's also Q tier, which is kind of an amalgam between caching and a storage pool, where it takes a bunch of hard drives, a couple of SSDs, and turns them into one big storage area, and then it intelligently learns what are the important files, and rather than copy them to the SSD, it physically moves them. Not just I/O and small files, but big files as well. That flexibility of the SSDs is pretty darn good. Yes, the M2 NVMe slots on this are limited. They're limited to PCIe Gen 3 times 2, so Gen 3 times 1. So each SSD bay will only give you 1,000 megs, but it's still better to have them for caching and pools rather than restricted to just caching, I think. Now, it doesn't have a fluid RAID system like SHR, it only has traditional RAID. Also, it only runs ext4 with no option of BTRFS. So, between these two systems, it really comes down to the flexibility you want in your storage, not just on day one, but scalability. The Synology makes expanding the storage a great deal easier and a lot more mainstream, connecting via the eSATA with the DX517 allowed there. Although that rigid and arguably more fluid and reliable structure of storage, again with things like those M2 SSD bays being used purely for caching, as good as they may be at the things that they do, they lack the customization and flexibility that the QNAP platform may offer you, which unfortunately has to also be taken on board with the idea you're going to spend more time going uphill on a learning curve because it's not as user-friendly, but also that you are running very customized and very unique configurations, which can be experimental. So between these two systems, when it looks at which one you should buy for your storage, at least in this area, it really comes down to you. Much more user-friendly, a lot more A to B, although it lacks a lot of the customization and frills. The Synology platform there is at least going to be a very fluid, straight down the line operational experience in terms of storage, with support of things like BTRFS and the fluidity of SHR, adding little cherries to the cake, whereas the QNAP allows a lot more flexibility on day one. It allows a lot more customization of your storage, better expandability, and a better understanding and access to what you want to do with the storage media inside. Now, in terms of ports and connectivity, that is another area where these two brands have drawn their line in the sand. As far as they're concerned, they know what they think the end user wants, and depending on you, the end user, almost certainly you're going to be drawn to one more than the other. Now, let's look at the 1522 Plus first, not because of any reason of being better or worse, but because things are so distinct. Now, it arrives with two USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, 5 gigabits per second each, which can be utilised for things like UPSs, adding additional extra external storage rather than expansions. There's also a few peripherals, but the overall list of compatible USBs have diminished somewhat in 2022 and DSM 7.1. On top of that, there's those two eSATA ports there for the expansions, and there are 4 1GBE LAN ports there. So although it lacks 2.5 GBE, this did upset quite a few people at launch. Still, nonetheless, those 4 LAN ports still allow support of link aggregation to allow up to 4 gigabit Ethernet, or around 440 megabytes per second. There's also the ability to add 10 GBE via a proprietary network expansion port and Synology's E10G22T1 mini expansion adapter there that slots straight in horizontally, and you can add a 10 gigabit Ethernet port to this. It's not included on the base level price, but it's still a nice option to have. And in terms of external connectivity, this is largely what we all kind of assumed Synology would go to. Maybe 2.5 GBE, we're a little disappointed this system didn't arrive with it by default, because a lot of people are thinking future-proof, and not just now, but is 2.5 GBE going to get bigger in the next few years, in which case, what is this NAS going to be in 3 to 5 years? But still, nonetheless, this is a good level, a good base level of connectivity there, and very much representative of what Synology think users are going to like in a 5-bay desktop NAS. Now, in the case of the QNAP, it arrives with USB, of course, and these are USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports that, of course, as mentioned, can be used for those expansions I mentioned, the 2s, the 4s and the 8-bay expansions. But it also arrives with 2 more USB 2 ports that can be utilised in a KVM setup with an HDMI port. That means this NAS can be set up to be standalone for things like surveillance, for multimedia, with support for remote controls. It can be utilised in a number of ways. And also with that USB ports, all of the USB ports there being a lot more diverse in how they can be used. Not just UPSs and adding external storage and a fewer peripherals that you can use. But there's also things, again, like keyboards and mice. There's things like Wi-Fi adapters. People have already started utilising the Wi-Fi 6 adapter from D-Link to add a Wi-Fi 6 wireless connection. There's also QNAP's own adapters as well. They can add things like additional 5 gigabit Ethernet ports there as well. Now, next to those, you've got the Ethernet ports with this system arriving with 2 Ethernet ports, not 4 like the Synology, but these are 2.5 GBE. So you've got 4 1 GBEs here and 2 2.5 GBE. So on the one hand, if you're only using a 1-port setup, 2.5 GBE with the right setup and a supported router or switch is going to give you 250 to 270 megabytes per second over that 100 to 109. And if we bring link aggregation into the equation, that's around 400 megs, and that is around 500 megs. So there's still more day one upgradability, network connectivity on the TS-464. Now, moving forward from that, the QNAP also has an expansion slot there, but it's traditional PCIe expandability. It's a PCIe Gen 3x2 slot with a wider range of supported network and other adapters that can be utilized. You can install dual port 10 GBE cards inside that slot. You can install a single port card, of course. You can add a Wi-Fi 6 card. You can add a storage expansion card that will have M2 SSD slots on board as well as 10 GBE, although do bear in mind that it's PCIe Gen 3x2, so only 2,000 megabytes per second to play with there on a dual lane. Ultimately, there's more you can do with it. It's non-proprietary, and although Synology are using this proprietary port there, it is still going to be easier to install. And ultimately, I think users that are looking for a more mainstream, easy to set up system, still going to err towards the 1522. But we can't ignore just how much more there is in terms of connectivity, scalability, and bandwidth here on the QNAP. There's a lot more ways in which you can interact with your data visually using the parallel HDMI application, HD Station, more USB devices supported there, a larger degree of network connectivity on day one, and a more flexible approach to expansions via PCIe than that of the 1522. Again, it comes down to kind of a focus on network connectivity on the 1522 and a much more diverse, arguably more experimental approach and diverse connectivity on the TS-464. It really does come down to what you want from the NAS and how you plan on interacting with it to retrieve or send your data. Which brings us neatly onto the subject of software. And between these two systems, QTS and DSM have grown more and more different. When they first started out, both of these platforms, although there's a few years of difference between their release windows, they were arguably quite comparable. They both had a file manager, they both had a backup manager, some light multimedia management. They both sort of brought a surveillance tool to market within about a couple of years of each other. But then after about 2015-16, they both splintered off in very different directions. Now, if you are a Mac user, if you are new to network attached storage and you're pretty much newer to IT and you want something that just does what it's told, is more user-friendly, holds your hand a little bit more, and just won't overpromise, won't overstretch, and effectively just says, I can do this, and that's what you want it to do, the Synology is going to have your back. DSM 7.1 has a lot more first-party applications that are more polished. They are much more user-friendly. They're designed to replace a lot of the third-party tools that you already utilize, either from cloud providers like Office 365 and Google Workspace, or if you're going to be utilizing to replace things like Skype and WhatsApp, or your calendar applications, or your mail applications, Synology Drive to replace your Dropbox. There's a lot more kind of mainstream user-friendly applications that are on there, as well as iOS and Android applications and desktop tools too. And with a better surveillance platform in terms of its usability and its access in the web browser, the Synology DSM platform is certainly the more polished of the two, but that does arrive with certain restrictions. It's less customizable than QTS, and it is a platform that, once again, doesn't overpromise, doesn't overstretch, but at the same time is not overly customizable either. It is designed to say, I can do all of these things as long as you do it my way. Now, the QNAP with QTS, on the other hand, has a much more even keel stance between first and third party. There's a huge range of first party applications, but they're not quite as polished as the Synology alternatives. There's also a greater range of support of customization and flexibility. The QNAP will say, I can do all of these things, but if you would rather do things your way, we can try to adapt. We've got the multimedia console that allows you to control indexing. There's most of the applications connect to app centers such as the virtual machine tool, allowing you to download Windows and other VMs directly to the NAS. There's Ubuntu Station there, or Linux Station, that allows you to immediately download a Linux VM onto the NAS. There's lots of things that this NAS, with its own first-party container application, support of a myriad more hybrid cloud platforms in hybrid mount, whereas hybrid share on the Synology only communicates with Synology C2. There's lots of ways in which the QNAP tries to be supportive and compatible with too many users, which often can lead to it feeling a little bit more information blast, because it's trying to be too many things at once, and that can often make things a little bit more complicated at the setup level. We also have to address the security-shaped elephant in the room. QNAP, they've had some problems. In 2019 and 2020, there was ransomware. They were targeted by ransomware from Deadbolt and others that, users were affected. And although they have taken their lumps, they say, and they've heightened a lot of their security, they've changed a lot of the network defaults, they've kind of changed some of the things that stop an inexperienced user to be able to open up all of the ports without really understanding the damage they could be doing. Users have got long memories, and there's no avoiding that Synology's platform, in terms of software and security, needs to prove itself to a lot more people. We want to have an extended period where they aren't hit by these things for a little while before a lot of users are going to trust them. Synology, on the other hand, they are still, as susceptible as anyone else, really, insofar as they're on a Linux platform like everyone else. They aren't immune. You look at their security advisor, much like QNAP, they have posted things that are innate to different applications, or Linux itself having vulnerabilities that then they have to patch in. But there hasn't been a large ransomware or malware hit on the Synology platform since about 2014 with Synology, which again was a long time ago, and Synology changed things, and seemingly they've never really had a big issue in this score. Whereas QNAP, on the other hand, has been hit by a lot of these different things, QLocker, Deadbolt and more, that a lot of users still do remember. So the big takeaway here is, if you're going for the QNAP platform, you have flexibility, you have customization, you have a greater degree of ways in which you can interact with the system, and the system to be adaptable to you. But that comes with an element of responsibility. It comes with an element of knowledge needing to be known by you in order to utilize this system to its best abilities. Otherwise, you may be doing stuff that either undermines the security of your system, or worse still, that you aren't running the system as efficiently, as optimally in its days, weeks, months and years of operation as you'd like. The Synology platform, on the other hand, is a more closed system. It's more user-friendly, and it doesn't overpromise, and at the same time, it doesn't overcomplicate. Of course, the trade-off there is a much more rigid system that can sometimes hit you with a wall when you want it to do a certain thing, or you have to adapt your working patterns to get it to work for you. And ultimately, between these two, if you're a business user, you're going to be more drawn, at least in this comparison, towards that 1522. If you're a home user, I think the QNAP is going to have an appeal to you. If you're a home user that wants to enjoy multimedia, you're a home user that wants to sort of tinker around with different applications. Or if you're an Android or a Windows user, I think the QNAP QTS platform is going to draw you in. If you're a Mac user or a photo video editor, someone that uses that kind of stuff, you're going to be drawn more towards the Synology aesthetic. They both are supported by Mac and Windows. They've both got mobile applications and desktop apps. They're both incredibly diverse and customizable tools, but there's no avoiding it that Synology, when I say they mean business, they mean business. This thing is more business focused, and the TS-464 still continues to try to find something that pleases everyone, occasionally to its detriment. But this has been the QNAP TS-464 versus the Synology DS1522 Plus. I hope you've enjoyed this comparison. If you have, click like. It genuinely helps me understand what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. And ever since YouTube took away the dislike button, that's getting harder and harder. If you want to learn more about this subject, if you're on the fence and about to buy, click subscribe. I do a video every day and I explore the whole world of data storage, not just NAS, but I do talk a lot about NAS, and hopefully I can help you. Lastly, use the free advice section over on NAS Compares. It's genuinely free. It's manned by me and Eddie the web guy. It's linked in the description, and if you need help choosing the right data storage solution for your home or business needs, what have you got to lose? Hiring a data storage expert can cost real money. So me and Eddie run this free advice service to pay it forward, so you should do the same. We run this so that we can give people impartial, informed advice on the right solution for them. It is genuinely free. We have your email to reply to you. We don't do anything with it, couldn't give a stuff. There's donate buttons, use them, ignore them, it's up to you. This advice is free. It might take us an extra day or so to reply to you because we get a lot of inquiries there, but at least this way, rather than a question in the comments that can get lost in the noise, the advice section allows us to answer each question, first come, first serve, and ensures we answer everyone as full as we can. So take advantage of it. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.